Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it's time to do the final power rankings for the 2023 USFL season. Yes, it's been a week after the season ended. I thought that was a good amount of time to actually go and digest and look back at especially how the playoffs went to see what teams deserve to change, what don't, and overall, how did the end of the season power rankings look? So, coming in at number 8 is the New Jersey Generals. Look, they finished as the worst team in the league at 3 and 7. They were the only team that couldn't win 4 games. And especially when you look at how they missed the playoffs, they head into week 10 in a winning in game. In fact, it ended up being that if they won this game, they would have won the division. They got absolutely clowned. Look, they got absolutely annihilated in this game. It wasn't even close. When you look at their team, once you get past their rushing yards, they really weren't that good at any other part of the game. In terms of punt return average, they were by far the worst at only 4.1 yards per return. Then when you also add in the fact that they were tied for the worst in turnover differential, and they were one of the worst teams passing wise in terms of yardage, you realize why this team really wasn't that good. They were really low in all those stats that really mattered in passing, turnover, and then one of the, extra stats in punt return yards. And let's be real, I don't think anyone shocked me putting this team this low. There was really nothing across the season that said, "Oh yeah, this team really is that good." No, there was never anything about the Generals that made you look like they were really great, aside from like the first 2 weeks of the season. But they ended up just completely just tapering off at the end. And it looked like they had everything out of the tank at that Week 9 match against the Stars. Generals at 8. Coming in at number 7 is going to be the Houston Gamblers. I understand if you have them higher. I think that the Gamblers, to me, have to be 7 or 6. It's just a matter of, do you put them above the team I have at 6 or not? I ended up just saying no. I'm going to stick with what I had at the end of the season. And the reason is really because of the fact that I think that once you get rid of Mark Thompson, this team really wasn't that good. Look, rushing yards per game, they were second in the league. Third down percentage, they were second in the league. But like I said a few weeks ago, they were number one by a huge margin. That third down percentage did nothing but drop the last 5 weeks of the season. And then when you look at Mark Thompson, he's the reason the rushing attack was so great. He averaged 81 yards per game rushing on the 8 games he was in. 14 of the 17 rushing touchdowns were by him. Then you look at the other stats. They were tied for the worst in turnover differential. They were second to last in points allowed at 230. And as you can see by who's number 6, it's by a pretty wide margin. So I look at this team and I say that they really weren't that good once you get past Mark Thompson. Kenji Bahar played well a couple games, and then a couple other games he'd play like absolute trash. So I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of it. So I'm gonna stick with what I've got. So yeah. Now we get into the number 6 team, and that's the Stars. The Stars, like I said, I fully understand if you put the Gamblers above them. Every other position in the power rankings, I fully stand by, and I feel like that's where it should be, and you have to have a team there. That's my personal opinion. 6 and 7 are close, but I put the Stars here. The Stars ended up losing 3 last games of the season to miss the playoffs. It was a bad losing streak that ended up costing them the playoffs. They got absolutely annihilated by the Panthers in the second half, hence why they got shut out in the second half. And stat wise, they were bottom of the league in rushing, points allowed, and also were last in net average of punts. So they really weren't great in a lot of ways. But I am putting them here solely because I think that when you looked at them at their best, I think that Cookus was the better quarterback. And I think he was probably the third best QB of the season. He played in a very bad O line and still was able to play really well in a lot of games. And I think that's just, like I said, it's close between them and the Gamblers. I fully respect your opinion for the Gamblers above them. I just personally don't. I think the Gamblers and Stars both are really fighting for that bottom spot. But I think the fact is that I just would trust Bart Andrus and Case Cookus more in a game against, Curtis Johnson and Kenji Bahar. So close one, but that's what I'm going with. Now, number 5 is going to be the Michigan Panthers. The Michigan Panthers were outside the top 3 in every single stat, literally all of them. But the Michigan Panthers also made the playoffs by winning their last game, 23-20, and they ended up barely losing to the Maulers in OT. Now, the only caveat to that game and why I didn't put them above number 4 on the list is because of the fact that the Panthers, that was a very fluky game. Look, they started EJ Perry, the new QB, in those last two games. And against the Maulers, they really only were in that game because of a lot of fluky, 70-yard, 50-yard touchdowns. But I think that overall, when you look at them, you've got to put them above those other teams that made the playoffs for a reason. They got right when they needed to. And with EJ Perry, it seemed like they were able to have an extra gear of offense. It just was a bit fluky. And even though when you look at their point differential and points scored, they were bottom in both categories. Note that this is before I added the extra playoff game, so where they were, the numbers are what they have with the playoff games. And even with the playoff games, in terms of points scored, they'd still only be above New Jersey and Memphis, and that's with an extra game, with one of their best games of the season. And point differential, they'd still be last. But I think that overall, though, I still would put them above the other two teams. I think that when you looked at them, they gave a really good shot against the Maulers. And the Stars were back. I mean, the Stars barely lost to the Generals in that game in week 9. And the Generals, like I said, left everything out there. So I think this is a fair ranking. Now, coming in at number 4 is the Memphis Showboats, the highest team to miss the playoffs. Now, they do go down a spot, but I think the Memphis Showboats do deserve to be here. When you look at their point scored and point differential, they ended the season 5th in both categories. Point differential, they still were 5th after you count playoff games. Points scored, they would drop to 7th. But like I said, that's because of the extra playoff games. And the fact is that the Showboats being that high anyway, even before that, despite the fact that they basically had like no real QB game, is insane. So I'm going to keep them here. I think when you look at the team, the reason to keep them here is even though they got absolutely annihilated by the Breakers, they gave the Stallions their best run in the last 3 weeks. The last 3 weeks of the season, week 10, division championships, and the championship, the Stallions looked unbeatable except against the Showboats where they gave them a really good run for their money. And the Showboats were third in turnover differential as well as being the leader in kick return average. They may have been near the bottom in both yards per game and third down percentage. But I think that overall, I think the Showboats showed a lot of gut in that 5-game win streak. And the fact that they nearly made the playoffs after that horrid start is a big testament to how this team is. And a lot of people, I think, are rooting for them next year. So we'll see. Coming in at number 3 is going to be the New Orleans Breakers. Breakers at 3, they moved down a spot, and I think it's pretty obvious why. Look, you got crushed by 25 points in your last game of the season in the playoffs, and even that makes it seem closer than it was. Really, it was more like a 32-point drubbing. It's just that, you got an extra few points at the end of the game. The Stallions absolutely obliterated them. Look, the Breakers were a very yin and yang team. They had 2 win streaks. They had 1 losing streak, and they lost the final game of the season. MBT and West Hills both had the league lead in passing and rushing yards, yet nobody would actually say they were the best player at their position. While they were both really solid, especially MBT, West Hills played a few really bad weeks at the end of the year. And really, this team was basically carried by the points allowed. That was pretty low throughout most of their win streak, aside from, the game against Gamblers. Then passing yards game, they naturally led the league in. Yards per game, they were second, despite having the number 1 rusher and passer, which is insane. And their turnover differential was second in the league. But like I said, the big reason why I don't have this team at number 2 is because of just how bad they got beat by the Stallions. I think that loss really does hurt them in the long run. I think that it was not a good game for them. So, I mean, granted, they're second in points scored and point differential both before and after you count the playoffs, as even with the Maulers having 2 games, they still would have been ahead of them, as they end at 259 and plus 28. But I think a lot of it, like I've said before, is because of the win streak they had, and the team did finish with a very solid record. They finished like 7-3 in the regular season, but it wasn't good enough. So I think that overall, when you look at this team, it was pretty clear that they weren't even remotely as good as the Stallions, and they didn't even put up a fight. They got absolutely clowned on by them. So I think that 3 is a fair spot for them. Now, coming in number 2 is going to be Pittsburgh Maulers. The Maulers move up in the world. They are the only team that moves up, and they move up all the way to 2 from 4. And the reason is, pretty simple. They actually gave a really good fight against the Stallions. When you look at the end of the year, this team got the hottest hand they could. They beat the Panthers, then they go and beat the Generals, then they go and beat the Panthers again in the playoffs. They won the last 2 games of the season to make the playoffs. They won both those games convincingly, and then they got to the playoffs. And even despite EJ Perry having the most BS of performances ever, and granted, the Maulers did also, have some extra help by that PI call at the end of the game. The Maulers still beat them. They beat all 3 of those teams to make the playoffs, and they gave the Stallions a pretty close game. The Maulers really could have won that game or at least made it close. The fact is, they did have 5 scoring chances. They had 5 field goal tries, though they only made 4 of them. They could have gotten a touchdown on the fumble recovery, but they got caught with a penalty. And overall, the team finished basically the number one team in special teams, best punt return average, best kickoff touchback percentage, best turnover differential by a mile. They were the best or second best in points allowed, just barely behind the Breakers. And granted, third down percentage, they were dead last. Yards per game, they were last. And passing yards, they were last. But they didn't need to be high on them. Because of their turnover differential being so good and the points allowed being good, they were able to just run the ball, just do short passes, just rely on special teams. That's how they made it throughout the playoffs. I think they deserve to be above the Breakers. I think that when you look at their performance those last couple weeks, it was substantially better than the Breakers, especially considering the fact that once you got past the Breakers, that one game they had, it's pretty clear that, the Mars were really that team. Now, coming in at number 1, however, is to the surprise of no one, the Stallions. They were champions. I mean, that's basically all that needs to be said. But just in case that's not enough for you, with the 2 playoff games they had, they finished with a plus 132 point differential. That means across the whole season, they averaged winning every game by 10 points. Think about it, that's insane. And their points scored was 362. That's over 30 points a game. Think about it. That's 30 a game they averaged throughout the year. This team cruised. Once they got past about week 5, they just cruised through the season. They were so dominant this year. It should be a surprise to no one that they got this high in the ranking. They are the number 1 team. They're the team to be and still are. So overall, that'll do it for the power rankings for the 2023 USFL season. Now we just got some more off-season content, to talk about while looking back at the season. Then we have off-season content, some more OG USFL stuff and NFL stuff coming out. Have some videos planned for the next couple weeks, so we'll see. As always, this has been Zom Fox. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified. And have a great night.